Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Alex Selfan. There's another Salty Dog webinar. And today, Dave Flynn from Quantum Sale is going to be talking to us about getting the most out of your downwind sales. He's going to be giving us his views, and I hope you have some good questions to ask. I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll definitely get to as many, and if not all the questions by the time today's over. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave and let him talk instead of me.
This.
So it didn't disturb that.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you guys can see all this.
Yep.
Of course, sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Yeah, that's what I want to do. Thank you.
Oh, I'm muted.
Ah, there we go.
Mm.
Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, very good.
Okay, great. All right, folks. Now for the fun part. Let's go downwind. That's what we're supposed to do, right? You know, our past talks have been about planning your cruising inventory, and they've been very much centered on, you know, the heavy air stuff and having a smaller sail, and mostly really working sail stuff. And each time I kind of get to the end and I throw in a little bit about how important to downwind sails, and it just never seems like enough time. So Alex and I thought it would be a good idea to say, okay, let's just focus on the fun part of going downwind. And so today we're going to talk about sort of completing your cruising inventory, the whole concept of reaching and downwind sails and how they fit in and stuff like that. For the first note, I mean, part of the problem with this whole area subject matter is, as sailmakers, we have made the thing incredibly confusing and difficult by insisting on labeling what are essentially generic concepts in sales with our own monikers, right? We got to call it a Gennaker or an MPS or a Flasher or a Thrasher or a Crasher or something, which totally kind of confuses the whole thing and it makes you have no idea, you know, what they really mean by that. So this talk hopefully will clarify that and just bring it back down to nuts and bolts and generic things, and kind of get past the marketing hype that has kind of, you know, made the thing far more complicated than it really should be. So, you know, the first question you got to ask yourself is why do you need downwind sails? So this is an illustration of the amount of time you spend at various wind angles if you were making a circumnavigation around the globe from west to east, which is the way you should do it, by the way. And you can see that really a relatively small portion of the time, like, you know, 13%, is at angles less than 70 degrees. You know, so it's a pretty tiny margin. You know, we're becalmed, you know, 4% of the time, but the vast majority of the time, you know, some 82%, we end up sailing at angles at 70 degrees apparent, you know, and as far back as, you know, we're able to sail. So our upwind sails, you know, which we know and love, you know, they don't do a very good job of that. I mean, this upwind Genoa, by its nature, has to be very strong, right? Because it has to be capable of handling, you know, high apparent wind velocities. It has to be relatively flat, and it has to have a very flat aerodynamic profile in order to be able to go upwind and control helm and heeling. And it has to be very heavy by its nature, because most of our boats have a minimum number of sails to sort of do it all. I mean, this boat here at least has 2 sails. It has a big sail and a little sail ready to go. But neither one of them is going to be very great when we start getting it off wind angles. So we need something that's more purpose built for that. And when you go cruising for long distances, you've got a lot of time on your hands to play with this stuff. You know, when you're sailing locally, you know, on Narragansett Bay or the Chesapeake or wherever you are, you know, you have to make turns fairly often. You may not be able to go in a straight line for, you know, hundreds of miles, but the beauty of offshore is once you're, settling down and headed toward where you're going, you could be on one point of sail for days. And that gives you a lot of time to get some of this stuff sorted out. So let's talk a little bit about this whole design window, this 70 degrees to 180 degrees. What do we do with this thing? Well, it is a wide design window. So one sail is actually, it's kind of hard to make it do it all. We'll talk about trying to, for sure. But, on the left, you've got this big, huge, classic asymmetrical running spinnaker, which is going to be great at broad reaching and running. And on the right, you kind of have one of these newer generation of specialty reaching sails. And you can do everything in between. So we need to kind of figure out, in terms of design criteria, what's going to be appropriate for the kind of sailing we're anticipating, our crew, and our boat. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into this equation. Certainly the boat characteristics have to be considered. We'll talk about aspect ratio and rig proportions and how they impact our choices. We'll talk about the dimensions, specifically the mid-girth of the sail and how that affects what the sail is capable of doing. And then we'll talk about, of course, overall depth. We'll talk about the distribution of the area. When you design a sail, you get a chance to play with how much you put in front of the luff versus how much you put behind the leech. And that has a big impact on what the sail can do or not do. And then finally, of course, handling considerations. I mean, if you're a small crew on a big boat, a big, huge sail just may be more than you possibly want to deal with or are able to deal with. So we've got to be practical about it. It's not just optimizing the boat's performance, it's optimizing how much we get to use this thing, because we still don't want to have too many sails in the boat, right? I mean, there's not enough room for them, and there's more exciting stuff like bicycles and dinghies and water toys to take care of. So we'll take a look at these things, but let's look first a little bit about just sort of the kind of boat you have and the rig proportions. This is a classic masthead rig. By masthead, I mean the forestay goes all the way to the top of the mast boat, and that has overlapping genoas. Right, you can see the genoa tracks down here, and boats like this actually typically at closer reaching angles do pretty well because that big overlapping genoa is it reaches nicely. It's big enough, as long as there's enough apparent wind velocity, that it'll power the boat up quite nicely. And so older style cruising boats that have big overlapping genoas reach pretty well at close angles, but where they suffer is at broader angles. When you try to get, aft of 130 degrees apparent or something like that, now the boat struggles. So some type of asymmetrical spinnaker works well for them. On the flip side of the equation, you've got this sort of the modern design trend, and with the small non-overlapping jib. And if you walk down the dock at the, major boat show and you looked at all the Hansas and Genoas and Beneteaus and Bavarias and everything, this is how they're coming configured now. Very few boats made with overlapping Genoas these days. Now, the good news about that is that they're really easy to handle when you're sailing upwind. Genoas are a pain in the butt. I mean, you got to drag them around the whole rig. There's all the sail to pull across and then pull in, so tacking is not much fun. On the flip side, having a small non-overlapping jib means that as soon as you start to ease the sheets and start to reach, even at closer angles, 60, 70, 80, 90 degrees, the boat gets underpowered pretty quickly. You'll actually see a lot of these boats today that have non-overlapping headsails completely, with self-tacking setups, which are very small. They're really underpowered the moment you start to reach with them. And also the sail doesn't set up and sheet very well. These rig types cry out for a specialty reaching sail. So on the right, you'll see a same boat with a specialty reaching sail and a little sail furled up inside it. So the other kind of boat that some of us have, of course, are multi-hulls. And these really come in two flavors. In this photo, you see more of a performance-oriented multi-hull. And you can tell because, well, you can't see them here, but there's dagger board trunks here. So if it has boards, it tends to be more performance-oriented. But also you can see the longeron, the center strut that it has. That's a characteristic of a performance multi-hull, and you notice it allows for multiple head soles on here. He's got a little jib, he's got some sort of bigger specialty reaching sail, and he's got a more downwind oriented sail on the outside. The other thing about performance oriented multi-hulls is they're fast, and so the faster you go, the further forward your apparent wind angle typically lives. This is the case for large, fast monohulls as well. I mean, if you have a relatively lightweight, long, fast monohull, you have much tighter wind angles that you sail at all the time than you do if you have a more displacement-oriented boat. This is a displacement-oriented catamaran, and this is the typical one in terms of the number of ones that are out there now. These are selling like hotcakes. They have a huge amount of room on them. They're really comfortable. They're stable, but they're not very fast, right? They're just, they're heavy, and you got your whole house with you, and so they have, you can't expect to sail as fast or with the apparent wind angle as far forward. So the type of sail that they need is quite a bit different than a performance multi-hull. So you got to decide where you are in the equation here. Do I have an older style masthead rig, overlapping jib cruising boat? Do I have a modern fractional boat with non-overlapping head soles and probably with masthead spinnakers? Do I have a performance-oriented multi-hull, or do I have a displacement multi-hull? That's going to have a big impact on which direction you head when you start to think about off-wind sails. So let's talk about specialty reaching sails first. And this is a place where the terminology has gotten horribly confusing. The term code zero is used loosely to describe a very broad category of sails. And sometimes they're called just code sails, sometimes they're called code zeros, but this is where this all comes from. Way back when, in 1998 specifically, during what was then called the Whitbread Round the World Race, they later renamed the Volvo Round the World Race, and simply the World Race now, they were sailing a boat called the Volvo 60. And the Volvo 60.
What are we doing?
Can we mute somebody out there, because I'm getting some horrible feedback.
Yeah, I think I got them.
Okay, great, thank you. So back in 1998, with these Volvo 60s, they had fractional rigs, non-overlapping small jibs. And as soon as they cracked off and started to reach, which they did a lot of going around the world, they were pretty underpowered. They were relatively heavy by today's standards as well. And so they had a rule in the class that defined a spinnaker as having a mid-girth of 70% or more. And that, by mid-girth, I mean the middle of the sail. What percentage of the foot length was that sail there? So if the foot length was X, then the mid-girth had to be at least 70% of the foot length. Anything inside 70% was considered to be a head sole and would have been rated as essentially as a Genoa, which would have thrown them out of the box of the rule, and then they couldn't have rated in. So they developed spinnakers, which is what the rule called anything with a girth over 70%, that were very flat and very close to being a Genoa, as Genoa-like as you could make them. For reference, a Genoa has a girth of 50%. So it's very flat and small by comparison. So at 70%, it was a little bit difficult to make these sails. you had to hang all this area on the sail, and to support that area, you had to have depth or girth. And as soon as you had depth in the whole thing, then it made it really hard to reach at close angles. There, and also, so that you try to make the sail as flat as possible, but with this minimum of 70% girth, it wanted to just flap, right? It didn't want to be stable. So the whole trick was to getting the thing to work without just flapping itself to death. And Paul Kayard and on his team on EF Language really probably get the lion's share of the credit for developing the sail, beating the rule. Every competitor in the race, by the end of the race, had some version of that. We worked, our company worked with Swedish Match, and we developed the sail along similar lines. But that sail was sort of the rule beater. And so these Volvo boats, the way they had carried typically 6 asymmetrical spinnakers, just to show you, to cover this whole range. And they're even, so they'd call them by their names. They'd call them a code 1, a code 2, a code 3, all the way up to 6. And so the even numbers, 2, 4, and 6, were for running, and the odd numbers, 1, 3, and 5, were for reaching. So now they had this new hybrid sail with this 70% girth that was closer than all of them. So they called it a code 0. And that's where the name comes from. And since then, there's been all kinds of development around a sail that qualifies as a spinnaker by its girth, by its minimum girth, but acts more like a Genoa. And in most handicap rules, up until just recently, that minimum girth was 75%. So it was even harder to make a really close-winded sail because it had to get bigger and it had to get fuller, and so it was less close-winded. But that's where this name started from. But it really covers a pretty wide range of sails. So they're all asymmetrical spinnakers. Call it a code 0, call it a Jenniker, call it a whatever you want. It's basically a sail that has a distinct luff, right? It's long along the one edge. It has a distinct leech, which is shorter. It has some sort of given foot length. And it has this mid-girth measured from the mid-leech to the mid-luff. That's usually expressed as a percentage of the foot length. But a code 0 is just an asymmetrical spinnaker that's flatter and smaller, basically. The problem is, for us cruising sailors, we don't have any of these stupid rules. It's actually not a problem. It's a good thing. So we can build a sail any size we want. There are no minimum girth restrictions, right? And the beauty of that is it opens this whole design box up from sails that are 50% girth, Genoas, all the way up to what is considered a spinnaker, which is typically 70 or 75% girth. And so you've got this big window that's perfect for a lot of cruising applications. So that opens this whole thing up for us and allows us really as sailmakers to build just what's appropriate, and the hell with the rules. So that it's still a pretty big design window. So sails that are often referred to as code 0s or code sails are really, in generic terms, they're specialty reaching sails. They're designed for closer apparent wind angles. And there can be subtle differences that have a big impact on the wind range that they carry. I mean, here are 3 sails, there's the same basic geometry, but if you start on the left, that's very Genoa-like. The mid-girth is pretty close to 50%. And then in the middle, you get a little bit bigger, and you probably have to get a little bit deeper as well. So maybe not quite as close-winded. And then the sail on the right, bigger yet, and probably more depth. So not nearly as capable of super close reaching angles. We find it, at least at Quantum, the simpler way to look at this thing is what apparent wind angle do you want the sail to work at? Because that's really, apparent wind is what we sail on. So do we want a sail that's capable of going to 40 degrees apparent? We can make you one. It's going to have a narrow mid-girth, somewhere between 50 and 60%. It's going to be really good light air upwind and close reaching. You know, it's basically taking the place of your Genoa. Material wise, it's probably going to have to be made out of something stronger than nylon. You know, the typical spinnaker materials we're used to are just not going to be strong enough, because as you sail at closer apparent wind angles and with more apparent wind velocity, the loads go up. So you need something stronger and lighter. So there's a whole family of specialized composites that are more appropriate for this kind of sail. You might want to be a little more general purpose, and you might want to say, hey, look, I really just want to target the middle range of angles, like 60 to 120. What we call it an apparent wind angle 60 sail, sort of with an optimum range between 60 and 120. Well, the mid girth can get bigger. It'll get to 60 or 70%. We'll be able to use it not just at close angles, but more in those kind of the middle ground range.
I had that crappy idea. I didn't forgot I had it.
And then and that sail usually also would be made out of composites as well. Go a little bit bigger, and you have a sail that's appropriate for maybe 80 to 130 degrees apparent wind angle. Really good at that. You know, this is not to say that you can't get inside these in certain light conditions, especially. I mean, I can take a symmetrical spinnaker and make it sail at 50 degrees apparent if I force it. I mean, it doesn't do it very effectively, but you know, it's got lots of drag and you're basically going sideways, but you can do it. But this is an optimum apparent wind angle range that we're looking at here. And so that sail would have a bigger girth, could be 70 or 80%, more like that almost a spinnaker thing. And so we'd be able to be great just forward of the beam to relatively wide angles downwind. And we might make that out of composites on a bigger boat, but you can actually start using, at least on smaller boats, you can use a heavier weight nylon, or there's some polyester spinnaker fabrics and things like that. So as you think about what sail to add for this specialty reaching category, you've got some options. And you need to think about it, about how your boat sails, what angles you want to target, and work with your sailmaker to make sure the design fits that box correctly. So there's another thing that's very wildly popular in the marketplace these days, and you're going to read lots about. And that's the sort of, is referred to loosely as a structured luff code 0. So the traditional sail code 0 typically was on a furling system. That's one of the beauties of it. And it would have a torsional rope in a tube up the luff of the sail, and that would be used to roll the sail up around. A bunch of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, racing sailors, specifically in the Maxi 72 class, began experimenting with getting rid of the rope and replacing the rope with just more fiber passes up the luff of the sail. So the sail had more strength, going up the luff. And those sails did a couple of neat things when you sailed with them, and do a couple of neat things. They're very sensitive to halyard tension, right? With a torsional rope in this luff, usually you just whack the tension onto the torsional ropes really, really tight, and it acts as a stay. With these structured luff sails, you actually, when you ease the luff tension, the entry of the sail flattens out, right? It allows the luff to relax, which projects some of that luff forward, and actually causes the whole sail to rotate and twist a little bit. So the driving force in the diagram in the bottom is more in the direction you want to go. It creates less heel. So structured luff sails have become very popular under a variety of names, Helix, and what XC is what we call ours, whatever. But all you're doing is taking the same basic specialty reaching asymmetrical and adding more strength in the luff by adding either fiber in a custom composite or by adding stronger panels in a panel sail approach to the problem. The trick about them, though, is again, they're a little harder to use because they're so sensitive to luff tension on the whole thing. And actually to furl them, they're still, even though they're called cableless, they're not. There's at least a small cable up the luff of the sail that sort of shares the load, because you do need to get the luff really, really tight in order for the furling system to operate better. And so with one of these sails, you tighten the halyard or tighten this rope with whatever system you're using just before you furl it or unfurl it. And then you kind of ease it into its trimmed position. So there's a little bit more going on here that makes them a little bit harder to use. And they're certainly a little more expensive because you've got to add this additional structure into the sail. But they do fly really nicely, and they are even more close-winded typically for a similar size and girth sail. But that everybody's they're jumping up and down and claiming they're the first to ever develop this and all the rest of it. Actually, we did flying luff code zeros, which is really what these are, in 1998 for Swedish Match. We found that the logic of tightening the torsional rope like crazy and making it like a stay actually didn't work all that well. And that when you ease the luff a little bit, the sail did just what we're looking at here. It rotated forward and was actually more capable of close wind angles. And Per Anderson, who was a designer for us, really developed that sail in 1998. But it's the rage these days. Everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. So call it whatever you want. It's a specialty reaching sail that is a great tool when you're doing long distance passages, because your typical small non-overlapping jib, that's going to be horrible close reaching. If you've got a bigger Genoa, you're better off, but still, as soon as you get aft of 80 or 90 degrees apparent, a heavy Genoa doesn't work very well. So this is a great tool to sort of add to your arsenal in the whole thing. So that's the specialty reaching angle box is what I call it. Apparent wind angles of 40 to maybe 120 or 130. Once we get beyond 120 or 130, we're really trying to go downwind, and the problem is actually a little bit different. So just a theoretical overview here a little bit. When we try to go straight upwind, it's impossible, right? We can't sail straight upwind. We got to bear off and we got to tack to get ourselves upwind. The reality is, when we try to go dead downwind, we can do it, unlike trying to go straight upwind. But a lot of times it's not very efficient to go straight downwind. And it's because of the apparent wind triangle. If we try to go dead downwind, well, all the wind that the boat is creating by moving forward is essentially canceling out the wind that's there, the true wind. And so the resultant apparent wind is really light. I mean, turn downwind on a pretty nice day and all of a sudden you're roasting, right? That's because there's very little apparent wind. Well, as soon as you head up a little bit, the boat starts to generate apparent wind velocity to fill the sails. And so typically on a displacement boat, under 10 or 12 knots of wind, I wouldn't even try to go dead downwind, ever. I would always tack downwind. I would head up to I got some pressure in the sail, and then I would go ahead and eventually I'd have to jibe. This could be 100 miles, and then I have to jibe again. And if I did that, even though I'd sailed a greater distance, I'd get there first, because I'm generating so much more apparent wind, the boat gets going well. To make this work, however, you've got to have a sail that's designed for this, and a heavy Genoa doesn't do it. With a heavy Genoa, I'd have to head way up in order to fill the sail and pressurize it. That is where a lighter, more powerful asymmetric spinnaker that's designed for broad reaches and runs works. Now, these things come in all flavors, okay, and sizes. I mean, here is the same boat, J160, and but the boat on the left is the boat on the right. But on the left, you can see that is a big, round, powerful sail, much, much wider at the mid-girth, right? And much deeper and fuller in terms of shaping. On the right, that's a relatively tall and skinny sail, and it's much flatter in terms of its shape. So again, in this design box, we can do all kinds of stuff from full and powerful to relatively flat and small. Still not in that, like the specialty reaching sail range, but much closer to it. And this also points out another thing to think about. When you talk about sail sizing and how big to make a sail, one of the critical things with an asymmetrical spinnaker is aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is the ratio of the height or the luff of the sail to the width or the girth of the sail. And on the left, that is a relatively low aspect ratio. And on the right, that is a relatively high aspect ratio. So the first thing you do when you design and size an asymmetric spinnaker is you shoot for an optimum aspect ratio. And that number happens to be 1.85 to 1. If you get much lower aspect ratio, you get like down into the 1.6 or 1.5 to 1, you get a sail that's basically, well, we call it the beach ball effect. It's very round and spherical, which means it's probably pretty stable and maybe good at a limited range of really deep downwind angles, but it can't sail at anything tighter at all. So it's really limited in what it can do. If you get too tall and skinny, then you get a sail that's unstable, that you can't really control the twist and the shape of. So getting the right balance of aspect ratio is really how you size spinnakers. And so all those formulas that you'll see, 1.7 times the J dimension, that's how you get the width of the sail, or 1.85 or whatever it is. Those really are irrelevant, right? You need to look at what you've got to work with, what the J dimension is. J dimension, by the way, or really SPL dimension is the length from the forward face of the mast to where the sail is tacked. That's the room you have in. And then you need to multiply that number by something that gives you that 1.85 or somewhere in that range of aspect ratio. So when you talk about how big a sail should be, that's really the determining factor. The aspect ratio relative to the length of your forward triangle. So for running purposes, we want a big fat guy, basically. Still an asymmetrical spinnaker, right? Distinct luff, distinct leach. But now the mid-girth is probably going to be almost as big or even sometimes bigger than the foot length, right? And so the sail's just as wide up here in the middle as it is down here at the bottom. And that means it's got to have a commensurate amount of shaping in there in order to make the whole thing work. And so the sail is going to be pretty round. So as you head up, it's going to limit the apparent wind angles you could sail at. But for broad reaching and running, this is the design criteria. When your target apparent wind angles are aft of 120 and maybe all the way back to 160, now you really can't go dead downwind even with a sail like this. That 160 to 180 range is still no man's land because you're tacking the sail on the center line of the boat to make it easy to handle and usable. So going dead downwind probably is an option. And as I pointed out in the earlier illustration, in under 10 or 12 knots, you definitely don't want to go dead downwind. But between 10 and 20 knots, maybe 22, 23, where you use this type of sail, you can still sail pretty deep. 160 is not out of the question. So, but dead downwind, you're still going to be tacking downwind to some extent. These sails are typically made out of nylon because they don't need, the loads are much lower at these deeper angles. So if it's a little bit stretchier, So what? Matter of fact, it's a little bit stretchier. It's probably good because there's a little bit of give there that actually makes it more stable. The other thing that makes a sail better at broader angles is if you took a straight line like we did in that original diagram from the head down to the tack, and then from the head down to the clew, and looked at how much of that sail's girth was outside the straight line luff versus outside the straight line leech. On a running sail, a lot of the girth, multiple feet of the girth, are outside the straight line luff. So when you ease the sheet, that's the material that rotates around the center line of the boat, projects out to weather, and enables you to go deep. If you had all that area on the front end and you started to head up and try to reach, it would want to collapse fairly quickly. And so you'd have to over trim the sail. And then you'd just be basically going sideways because you'd be loading the whole thing up. So in a reaching spinnaker, you get the opposite deal. You get relatively minimum luff projection, and you take whatever extra area you need to support and you put it on the back end. So you can ease the sail without collapsing it, and that'll create much less drag when you're reaching at close angles. And you notice this runner was referred to as an A2. This goes back to that Volvo Whitbread deal. An A2, again, is a running spinnaker. It's an even numbered sail. And we have just kept that convention. It's used universally in racing sails. Why not use it in cruising sails too? So an A2, even number runner. A3, whoops, let me go back the other way. A3 is a little more of a reaching sail, a little more of an all-purpose sail. This is what we call an AP, where if you're hedging your bets and try to cover as many angles as you can, you're going to split the difference, and you're going to go smaller in the mid-girth, 80 or 90%. Okay. Your apparent wind angle, I mean, you can probably get to 100 degrees apparent wind angle, no trouble with the sail, and fairly efficiently. In 5 knots of breeze, you could probably get to a 60-degree apparent wind angle. Maybe not all that efficiently, but you could do it. But very efficient in the 100 to 150-degree apparent wind angle range. And also a little bit smaller, so easier to handle, still all-purpose. So this is a common choice for one sail to do it all on a cruising boat. And the material, again, is typically nylon. It's still strong enough, and we don't mind the stretch. This is an A2, the mother of all asymmetricals. It's big, and you can see how wide it is and how wide all the way up the girth is. Right? This is an A3. Here we are hard reaching, and it's smaller and flatter. Actually, this one's still got plenty of shape in it, but we're well inside of 90 degrees apparent right here, right? So that's as you get to a downwind asymmetrical versus a specialty reaching sail, you still got some room to play with, and you can still figure out what works best for you and your boat. So I have to mention this because it usually comes up as a question. All right, I want to go downwind, and what about these parasailers? A parasailer is a symmetrical spinnaker. Note that the luff and the leech are the same length. The foot is the same as the mid-girth. Pure symmetrical spinnaker. The only difference to this symmetrical spinnaker is it's got this funky wing thing up here in the middle that supposedly does all kinds of magical things. It creates lift and actually lifts the whole bow of the boat out of the water and keeps it from going in when you're going downwind. It makes the sail more stable somehow. I'm not exactly sure. The problem with this slit up here and all these control lines and stuff that go in here, if you ask any aerodynamicist worth their salt, they will burst out laughing to suggest that would have any of those positive effects. It just is against the laws of physics. If you've got a big round sail at the front end of the boat, it is going to push the bow down into the water, guaranteed, no other way around it. This is not going to stop it and create an offsetting lift factor. So my thing is with these symmetrical spinnakers is they have their place, but save yourself a lot of money. Don't cut a hole in it with all the control lines in it. Just get a regular symmetrical spinnaker. You know, on a lot of catamarans, or in multi-hulls in general, symmetrical spinnakers are used. I mean, multi-hulls go dead downwind rather nicely. They're very stable platforms, and they don't roll and rock and round like our monohulls do. And a lot of times they won't even put a mainsail up because they can't use the mainsail out that far, but they'll just use a symmetrical. They've also got a much wider base to fly it on, so they can spread the two edges out away from each other. If you're using a symmetrical spinnaker, it's set up with twin lines, just like a racing symmetrical is. It's got a sheet that goes all the way after the quarter, and it's got an after guy, effectively, that goes down to a block in the middle of the boat. And as you know, so the tack's to the middle of the boat, and then the sheet's aft. And with these, you really can get dead downwind, or pretty darn close to it. Much better on a multi-hull, though, than on a monohull. You know, the other claim of the parasailer, which is absolutely specious, is the fact that, oh, I can sail at these really close wind angles. Well, yes, you can sail at close apparent wind angles, but it is incredibly inefficient, right? Look at how round that thing is. And all the force in the sail is just going sideways. It's just drag. If you've ever raced sailboats with symmetrical spinnakers, you'll know that you can sail at some incredibly tight angles. You can make the sail, you know, stay full at those angles, but it's horribly inefficient. And so all the testing and stuff in these things is these sails are slower than their asymmetric counterparts, and certainly, you know, no more stable or bomb-proof. And the beauty of this is if you give me what you would budget for one of these, I can build you two asymmetricals for different purposes. That's how expensive they are. So that's my take on the parasailer. But symmetrical spinnakers potentially have their place, usually on multi-hulls, not so much on monohulls, because on monohulls, you really need a pole. I mean, you need to somehow be able to get the tack of this spinnaker well out to weather. And the boat on a monohull is just really too narrow to do that very effectively. You know, so the multi-hulls have the advantage here. In the right-hand photo, by the way, this is an asymmetrical that is actually, they've added a second tack line to it. See, there's a bowsprit here. So they've got that going for their tack line. But now they've added a second tack line to pull the tack around to weather. Again, to bring the sail out from behind the mainsail and project area. And that makes this asymmetrical really good at very deep angles. I mean, this is where you finally can get to the, you know, 170 degrees apparent wind angle kind of thing. So they have an advantage that we can't get on a monohull without a pole. So we've got to accept, you know, that working physics problem. There is a way, by the way, so I did lie to you earlier. You know, I told you that these heavy working headsails can't go downwind. Well, they can. If you run wing on wing, they actually can work quite effectively. Now, will this work in under 10 knots? Not really, because you don't have enough wind velocity, really apparent wind velocity to you know, drive the whole sail plan and fill the sails. But you start getting a more than 10 knots of breeze, you actually can go dead downwind as long as you have a whisker pole to stabilize the whole program. So you have to have a whisker pole, you need to be able to move, you have to have a topping lift to hold that up in the air. And then to stabilize it, usually you need some tension on the lazy sheet pulling forward, and you need to move the sheet lead well forward to the beam. So you're having something pulling down. But the nice thing about a wing on wing setup actually is you can sail dead downwind, and even you can head up probably 20 degrees, you know, even 30 degrees from dead downwind. And the sail, if you let it, the pole forward some, will still fly quite well. So there is a place for the whisker pole and going dead downwind in our whole thing. and in a certain wind range, when you really want to go dead down, it's a better combination than a regular asymmetrical spinnaker. So there is a place for this whole thing. But regardless, all of these asymmetric spinnakers set up in a similar fashion, right? They have a halyard that is going to be above has to be above out in front of the headstay, okay? They have a tack line that controls the tack of the sail. And on the right, you see a conventional sail with no pulpit or anything like that. On the left, you see something with a bowsprit on it. Now, bowsprits are really nice things to have for any of these downwind sails because they help you project the sail further away from the mainsail. And you can, much easier to keep the sail full out there. It also gives you the ability to make the sail a little bit bigger, right? Because you got more, room in here to fit a bigger sail in. So the sprits are nice. There's no question about it. And a lot of conversion kits for older boats are adding sprits onto them. But still, just tacking it like the boat on the right inside the pulpit like that on a separate tack line works just fine. Sheeting is always done to the clew, right? The clew down to the quarter of the boat. So just like any spinnaker in any book. So there's the basic setup. And if you're going to jibe it, you've got one sheet that's lazy that goes around the headstay, so that when you jibe, you can pull the thing down. So that's the basic setup. The real question these days, of course, is to furl or to not to furl. Equipment manufacturers who make furling systems realize that, hey, there are some of these asymmetricals that actually furl it pretty well. And so quick to jump on the bandwagon to make your sailing easier, they started furling downwind sails. There are two basic types of furling sails, furling systems. One are what are called bottom-up systems, which furl the sail from the bottom. And then the others are what are called top-down systems. And then the third option you've got are good old traditional spinnaker socks. The ATN spinnaker sock still has its place. If you think you want to try to be able to furl, you first have to look at a couple of things. If you have a masthead rig boat, you have to have enough room. If you look up here at the top in figure 1, you have to have enough room between that headstay attachment point and where the spinnaker halyard is sheeted to, the block for that, in order to allow room for a furled spinnaker to even get in there. Many traditional cruising boats do not have this room. So the only way you can do it, they look like that on figure 2. So the only way you can do it is to extend this crane off the top of your mast and get a spinnaker halyard block further out. But you can't do it if the block's too close to the headstay. It just, the spinnaker will just furl up around the headsail. On a fractional rig boat, most of the time on a fractional rig boat, figure 3, the spinnaker halyard is quite a bit higher than the attachment point of the for the headstay. And a lot of times it goes all the way to the masthead, so that works great. But if for some reason your spinnaker halyard sheave is led down just where it's tight above the headstay, then that furler is not going to work, right? The other thing you have to look at is at the bottom. Is there enough room for a furling drum? In figure 5, I've got a little bit of bow sticking out in front of the headstay, and I can come straight down from that attachment point without running into the pulpit and have a good clean lead and room enough for this drum at the bottom. But if the pulpit gets in the way and I don't have enough room, well, I got to make some significant adjustments to my hardware and bow pulpit and stuff. And this is why in figure 7, a sprit works great, because it gives you the room you need for that furling system to work for, And sometimes you can find a way to make the anchor roller work or things like that, but that's all going to take consideration on the front end when you think about, can I furl or not? So a bottom-up furler we're all familiar with. If you look on the left, that is a conventional furling system. This is a Solent rig Passport 545, and they put their big reaching specialty sail right out there on a regular old furling system, and it just lives there. And this is an AWA 60, by the way, in case you're curious. And because it's a conventional furling system, the bottom of the tack is fixed to the drum. When the drum spins, the tack winds up around either a rope or, in this case, just around aluminum extrusions. But as the sails get wider and bigger, it's harder and harder to wind the top in. Those bigger girths that we've talked about, well, they don't want to get wound in kind of nice and cleanly and efficiently. So some clever Kiwis, a bunch of years back said, well, why do we have to furl from the bottom up? Why don't we go ahead and put a swivel on the top, which is fixed, where we lash the sail to, and on the bottom, we'll let the tack float. It'll spin. So when we start to twist this cable, this torsional cable, the top will start to wind up first, and the bottom will lag behind, and we'll get that finicky mid-girth furled away much more rapidly and much more reliably. So if you're going to go with a bigger girth sail, you really want to use a top-down furler. Bottom-up furlers will only work on relatively narrow sails. Once the girth gets much over 60%, all bets are off on a regular, clean, reliable furl with a bottom-up furler. You want to think, top-down. As sails get over, 90% girth, any furling system, top-down or otherwise, is going to struggle. You might be able to get it to work. It's going to become very technique dependent. You're going to have just the right angle. You're going to have the right tension down on the sheet. You're going to have to, be pulling down on the leech to get the thing to work. So usually we say that, about, 85 or 90% is as big a girth sail as we would reliably try to furl. Once you get beyond that and you get to one of these big A2 runners, spinnaker socks still really work very well. The sock that you pull down over the sail so that when you hoist it, it's inside it. And then when you want to let it loose, you pull it on up. They are a good way to go on big running asymmetricals. They're simple, they're reliable, they're much less expensive. You do have to go up in the bow to pull them down. That's, you can't furl them from the cockpit, but they work. So to furl, the sail has to be of a moderate girth. Big runnings, asymmetricals, you can try it, but we're not going to guarantee it furls reliably on a regular basis. So what would I have on my perfect cruising boat? With my unlimited budget, of course, I would have the boat on the left with a really sexy Italian girl, of course, steering the thing. I think she comes with it. But, to tell you the truth, I'd have both, because my cruising boat would have the smallest headsail I could get away with. So I wouldn't have to fight it when I was going upwind, and it would have a really big range. And then when I was reaching, I'd have a sail that's purpose built for that, like one of these specialty reaching sails on the left. And then for broad reaching and running, I'd have some sort of full-size asymmetrical. So yeah, I'd have it all, I guess. But again, I have no budget. But you can do everything in between here, and you could essentially combine these two and find something that strikes down the middle and get one sail to do as much as possible for you. So that's an overview of what your options are and what things you need to think about as you look at adding sails for this big downwind window that you're going to spend a lot of time in when you go cruising. If you need help sussing this all out, of course, we're here to help. As Salty Dog members, I am your personal advisor, and there is my contact information. If you need to call me, feel free. There's my email address. There's lots of information on our website, quantumsails.com. So feel free to get in touch with us and help us plot your strategy. Even if you don't have us build sails for it, we're happy to act as an advisor. So I'm going to shut down my screen and flip it back over to Alex and see if I can answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Dave. This has been really informative. And we do have some questions. I think the first one is actually the one, I'm going to start with the last one only because I'm chuckling because it's exactly what I asked you about before we started. How would you deal with a boat rolling downwind? I knew that would come up.
You did this question, Alex, didn't you? So as he tried this out of me earlier. So this is a technique question. And it obviously comes down to, first of all, you've got to have the right spinnaker for this. So you're going to have one of these bigger, rounder asymmetrics. If there's a couple things you can do to prevent rolling. Rolling is caused by the boat is unclear about which tack it's on, right? With the wind almost right behind it, really the spinnaker could be on either side of the boat. And so when it begins to roll to weather, which is really where you don't want it to roll, if you over trim the spinnaker at that point, or actually just before the boat starts to roll, you anticipate and over trim the spinnaker, and you will dampen that roll to weather. And then as it starts to roll back to leeward, if you ease the sheet, that would counterbalance that. Now, this means you're going to have to be trimming constantly. And on a race boat, that's what you do. To dampen the roll, you aggressively trim just before it rolls to weather, and you aggressively ease just as it starts to roll back to leeward to try to keep the boat underneath the spinnaker as opposed to the spinnaker dragging the boat from side to side. This is pretty impractical, obviously, when you're cruising. But a couple other things you can look at. One, most asymmetricals on cruising boats are, fly on a tack line and have a sheet to the leeward quarter. There is a tendency when you're broad reaching and running to help the sail project more areas to let the tack line up. And when you let the tack line up, that allows the boat to roll and oscillate more because it lets more of the spinnaker get to weather in that portion of the cycle. Likewise, the spinnaker sheet, when you start to go dead downwind, if it's all the way after the quarter, you're not really pulling down and choking down on the clew, and so you're letting the leech twist open, which causes rolling. So if you could move the lead forward by either just using a twing, a small line that goes over the spinnaker sheet to pull the lead down forward, or even pulling it down in a block further forward, that will definitely dampen the oscillation and the rolling. The final solution, however, is at some point, on a monohull particularly, you have to head up. You can't sail dead downwind. You can't sail dead downwind in 10 to 12 or under 10 knots of breeze, and it comes hard to sail dead downwind in over, I don't know, 22 or whatever. It depends on, your boat. The other thing that does a lot to dampen rolling is steering aggressively. So if as the boat rolls to weather, you already anticipate that and you poke the bow up to get ahead of the spinnaker. So now when the thing starts to roll to weather, the bow's already there underneath the spinnaker. And then likewise, when it starts to load up and starts to roll back to leeward, if you get the boat borne off. So, but that takes aggressive steering. So again, if you want to steer full time, you can definitely dampen the oscillations. If you want to go along under autopilot, you're not going to have that ability to anticipate and stuff. So you're going to be better off just heading up a little bit.
Okay. What if they're not flying an asymmetric and they're using maybe a whisker pole that you described towards the end? Anything different there?
Yeah, well, make sure you have a vang on the main, right? So if the boom is allowed to rise up in the air, you don't have control over it, that will also promote oscillation. And then don't let the whisker pole fly too high, right? Make sure you've got a good, either a fore guy or a lazy sheet or something pulling down, because if the clew is allowed to rise up in the air, then the sail's kind of floating around loosey-goosey, and that's going to make the boat oscillate more. So yeah, choking down the sails when you're on a run, be it an asymmetrical or even a Genoa, are the only way you can dampen that oscillation outside of some aggressive steering.
Okay. Now, if you're, another question, this actually was one that I posed. What is, again, it's a technique question. What technique would you use to kind of capture your ASIN with the sock when it's really starting to blow?
Yeah, invariably, we always wait too late to take these things down, don't we?
Yeah.
Or it's 3 o'clock in the morning and it's pitch black. One thing you may do is avoid using one if it's in pitch black and squally conditions. But so the trick to any of these socks is to unload the thing as much as possible, so you don't have to fight the downhaul line. So you got this continuous line, it either pulls the sock up to release it, or it pulls down to put it away, which is what we're talking about here. So if the sail is loaded, when you're trying to pull that line down, you're making your whole life much more difficult. So you want to put the boat on a broad reach where you have the least amount of apparent wind for that velocity. You basically want to hide the sail somewhat behind the mainsail. The only danger is if you get too deep, then you'll get to the point where you're almost accidentally jibing and the sail starts to want to be on either side of the boat. And that's probably not good either, right? That you can get the sail wrapped around the headstay that way. So you want to sail as deep as you can, but clearly keep the wind on one side of the boat. Then you want to totally unload the sail to pull down to the downhaul. And that means completely releasing the sheet. So the sail's absolutely luffing. Some boats and some users actually find leaving the tack line or leaving the sheet on a little bit, just releasing it partially, and completely releasing the tack line works better, because then the sail actually gets buried further behind the mainsail and it's almost pressed up against the main, where it will have less exposure, So that's something that might work or might not. And then finally, you might want to find a way to get more horsepower on the downhaul, right? On bigger boats, what we do is that downhaul line for the sock is long enough to go through a block on the rail and then back to a winch, where I can pull the sock down with some assistance. And certainly if loads are a problem and you're struggling to pull the sail, that's line down, then setting it up on at least at a block, just to give yourself better leverage. But a block led to a winch is the way to do it.
Okay, that's interesting. And then I have a kind of a catamaran question. Is there a benefit, and you kind of talked about this, I think, a little bit, of taking the ASIN tack to windward when you're in the 160, 170-ish apparent wind angle?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was going over that section about, symmetrical spinnakers and going deep, the beauty of a multi-hull is you've got this big, wide, stable platform, and you've got these two bows sticking out there. So you aren't limited to the center line tack point. So if you put a second tack line on the sail and let it over to a block on the windward bow, you would end up being able to effectively, it would act like a spinnaker pole. It would allow you to bring the tack of the sail to weather, getting it out from behind the mainsail and allowing you to project area effectively and sail at much deeper angles. So yeah, that's a powerful tool actually on a multi-hull. Monohull sailors don't get to do that unless they have a spinnaker pole.
Right. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? So I guess in summary, it sounds like if you've got the budget, a code 0 and an ASIN is kind of a good combination.
Yeah, some sort of specially reaching sail and then some sort of broad reaching special sail would be ideal. Again, on one of the advantages of older style cruising boats with overlapping headsails is there isn't as much need for that specialty reaching sail as there is on these more modern boats with these very small jibs.
Right. Okay. I know my own experience. We flew the code 0 and probably up to 20 knots, but the apparent wind was less, and we kept it at like a 160 apparent wind angle. So we kind of winged it out on windward side. And we didn't have an asymmetric, so we kind of cheated and used that.
Did you use a pole or how did it?
Oh, this is on a cat, so we could. do
Oh,
it.
a cat. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, we had an instant pole. Yeah, 12 feet of boat.
Right.
But I was really surprised that we could get that much out of the sail.
Yep. Well, and again, you were effectively, it's kind of adding a whisker pole, bringing it out to that. You know, like,
Exactly. All right. All right, folks. Well, if you don't have any other questions relevant to this, I'm going to end the recording if I can find the button. And if you guys have anything else you want to chat about, we can do that after I stop the recording. Dave, thank you very much again. I think this has been really informative. I can't wait to get the boat in the water now and try a couple of things. So I hope everybody else feels the same way. And I'm going to stop the recording.